Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Twilight Eyes by Dean Koontz. Now, Twilight Eyes was first published in 1985, however, there was an expanded edition in 1987. Now, I've only read the original 1985 edition, which I have right here. Now, from what I understand, apparently this edition of the novel is actually only the first half of the story. And that was something I wasn't even aware of until years after I first read this novel. Now, from what I understand, the second half of this story really might as well have been a sequel, but instead of publishing the sequel as its own novel, he published it as the second half of the 1987 expanded edition. Now, what I decided to do is when I get my hands on the 1987 version, which is the more widely available version, I'm just going to review the second half, which I think is called Dark Lightning. I'm going to review that as its own novel. Now, Twilight Eyes has a special place in my heart because this was actually my first Dean Koontz novel. I first read it when I was 18 years old. Obviously, I reread it in preparation for this review. Now, I'm not as big of a Dean Koontz fan as I am Stephen King, but I do like most of what I've read from him. He's written a few books I didn't particularly care for, but I've liked most of what I've read. Especially his books like Watchers and his novella Chase, which was published in his collection Strange Highways. Now, for years this has been one of my favorite Dean Koontz stories, and it still is for the most part. However, reading it again 9 years after I first read it, I definitely noticed that the book does have some flaws. It's still a good book, but I wouldn't say it's a perfect novel by any means. And again, I still have only read this edition of the novel. Now, the plot of Twilight Eyes is it's set in 1963, and it follows a young man named Slim MacKenzie. Now, that's not his real name, it's only an alias he adopted because he's actually on the run from the police for murdering his uncle. But the reason he murdered his uncle is because his uncle murdered several other members of his family, including his father. And it turns out that his uncle, who was only his uncle by marriage, wasn't even a human being, but was actually a goblin in human form. It turns out that goblins live among us and have probably lived among us for thousands of years, and Slim has the power of second sight. He has what his grandmother used to call Twilight Eyes. He has the ability to see the goblins among us. So, Slim ends up joining the carnival, and he finds a new life among these carnival workers, but the carnival ends up coming to this town in Pennsylvania that turns out to be a breeding ground for goblins. So, that's the basic plotline of Twilight Eyes, or at least the first half of Twilight Eyes. Again, when I get my hands on the expanded edition, I'm just gonna review the second half as its own novel. Now, one of the things I do really appreciate about Twilight Eyes is it's a very self-contained story, yet there's such a complex mythology to this that Dean Koontz honestly could have written 10 novels based on this mythos. And while rereading this, I really did sort of get the impression that maybe Dean Koontz originally wanted this to be a whole series, and the book really does feel like an early precursor to something like his Odd Thomas series. Like, there are a lot of similarities between the Slim MacKenzie character and the character of Odd Thomas. Now, in the novel, you find out that whenever there's, like, a major tragedy that happens on sort of a massive scale, usually it's the goblins who are responsible, and the goblins are almost like vampires in a way, only instead of feeding on blood, they feed on this psychic energy produced by human suffering. And something that Slim notices is whenever goblins gather together in mass, you could bet your ass there's gonna be some major tragedy, and the goblins are almost like vultures in a way, just waiting for this tragedy to happen. And it's actually a relatively political novel. Now, the book is set during the Cold War, and there are a lot of Cold War politics in the story. And because the goblins live among us, there are some people in positions of power who are actually goblins, and it turns out that some of the goblins actually want to start a nuclear war. And also also, since the novel is taking place in 1963, it opens up with the line, "It was the year they murdered our president in Dallas," so there is this subtle implication that perhaps the Goblins were responsible for the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But there's also a lot of social commentary in the book about how cruel we as human beings can be to each other, so it's this whole idea that maybe we deserve the Goblins in some way. Now, throughout the story, you're never quite sure where the Goblins came from or what exactly they are. You're not sure if they're demons or perhaps they're aliens, but you do eventually find out where they came from, and when I first read the book, I didn't particularly care for their origin, but looking at it now, and given what the themes of the book are, their origin does fit in thematically. Because the Goblins are very much a metaphor, they're sort of an allegory, and again, there are a lot of Cold War politics in the novel. Now, where the book does kind of suffer a little bit, in my opinion, is you have two characters in this book that, in a lot of ways, are almost more interesting than the protagonist himself. You have a character named Joel Tuck, who is a carnival freak, and I know that's not a very politically correct thing to say, but professionally, that's what he is. He is part of the carnival's freak show, but he also runs the freak show as well. He's a man with severe facial deformities, and he also has 3 eyes, but he's also an extremely intelligent and well-spoken man, and an extremely kind man. And he is a fascinating character, and when you find out his backstory, like, you would almost want an entire prequel story about him. And then you have the character of Rhea Raines, who is this woman who works at the carnival that Slim develops a relationship with, and she's also a fascinating character with a really tragic backstory, and she also has a dark secret. But again, in a lot of ways, both her and Joel Tuck are far more interesting and far more complex characters than the main character of the story. Now, there are some really weird sex scenes in the book. Now, when I first read the book a couple of years ago, they didn't really bother me, but reading it again, they are really bizarre, at least in the descriptions. Now, I'm no prude by any means, but during these sex scenes, Slim describes the feeling of his semen going into Rhea when they're having sex, and it's like something out of a really bad erotic novel, and it doesn't really fit tonally with the rest of the book. Now, I know Dean Koontz early in his career did write some erotic fiction, so maybe it's a byproduct of that, or maybe he felt pressure from the publisher to include sex scenes like that, or maybe he was working something out through his writing, I don't know, and I'm not judging either, but again, tonally those scenes really didn't fit, and they felt really, again, the descriptions were just so weird. But besides those really awkward sex scenes, Twilight Eyes is actually a really good book, and some of the descriptions of the carnival in this book are honestly really beautiful and sort of Ray Bradbury-esque. Now, the original 1985 edition of Twilight Eyes comes with some illustrations from Phil Parks, and the illustrations in this book are absolutely beautiful, so before I end this video, I just want to show some of the illustrations in this book. I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be Dean Koontz right there. It's really cool how in this edition of the book, the illustrations and the prose kind of mix together at certain points. This is another example of that. That, of course, is Joel Tuck. But that was my review on Twilight Eyes by Dean Koontz, and once again, eventually I am going to read the second half of the 1987 edition and review that as its own novel.